Weston.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Whether or not Harold Macmillan actually said it's events, dear boy, or not, of course it is events that define the times, and it is, of course, how governments and politicians respond to them. We face, clearly, huge uncertainty. Brexit, now compounded by the coronavirus, the US-China trade war, and the global economic headwinds. But clearly the growth forecasts are now not at all looking good. The Bank of England now predicting just 0.8% this year and up to 1.4% for 2024. And it is the impact of Brexit, which of course will be quite significant, in particular if we follow some sort of Canada-style trade deal, where we're told that we will see a fall of 8.6% in our GDP. And already the OBR is quoting Brexit as having an impact of 2% on our economy. As Hillary Clinton said, it is the greatest act of self-harm. So whether it be Brexit or the coronavirus, I appreciate that the Chancellor has had a tough challenge, and I commend him for doing what he has in such a short period of time. But you have to look at what, there's been much debate and discussion about what happened in 2008, but the reaction, compare and contrast the reaction of the US government under Obama with his American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, which pumped in $760 billion fiscal support for the economy, and how that compared to what we did here in the UK from 2010 onwards. And you see the tick up almost immediately within a couple of years of the US economy as it returned to pre-crisis growth, whereas it took the UK 4 or 5 years to actually achieve that same level. So what we have now lived through is a decade, a lost decade, really. And we have now, as we've heard earlier, managed to double the debt, the national debt. This period of austerity, which I always consider to be a benign word, has been felt throughout our society, but particularly by the most vulnerable. Closure of 500 Sure Start children's centres, 26 in Warwickshire. Our schools and colleges seeing a real terms cut of £7.7 billion, equating to a 7.8% decrease in per pupil funding in my constituency of Warwick and Leamington. And whilst I welcome what the Chancellor was saying about capital investment in further education, it is capital. And we need more investment, more revenue spending in this super important sector, which is critical to our economic future. So compare and contrast where we see the impacts of the welfare cuts in this country, where we've seen a £39 billion reduction in social security spending this year. Compare and contrast and the consequences of that, which has led to so many people not just living in extreme hardship, but as was reported just last week, 69 people committing suicide in response to the circumstances they faced. And Errol Graham being the saddest case of dying through lack of food. By contrast, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act that I mentioned earlier, according to the analysis by the Council of Economic Advisers, prevented millions of Americans from falling into poverty, more than 5 million in just 2010 alone. Here we have 14 million people living in poverty, record numbers of children, 500,000 additional children living in poverty since 2010. Let me turn to health and social care, where the Chancellor made only passing mention, actually, of social care. But, of course, it is critical to our National Health Service. Quarter of the workforce on minimum wage, 100,000 vacancies, but no promise to remove the restrictions on non-UK residents being able to work in that sector. But without them, the NHS is going to be under ever greater pressure. We have 44,000 vacancies for nurses, 100,000 in staff, and we've lost 17,000 beds, as we know. Now, I appreciate that the Chancellor is talking about a further 50,000 nurses, but of course, as was debated frequently, how many of those are actually new and how many of them are actually already within the system. And the talk of refurbishing hospitals and potentially new hospitals is very welcome, but it is absolutely about the revenues that we need to be investing in that sector. And the frontline workers, health workers, social workers, many of whom are on zero-hour contracts or minimum wage, that if they are eligible for standard sickness payment, that they will, state sickness payment, will receive only £94, £25 per week. And it's a choice for them whether they should be able to go to work or actually stay at home in the circumstances of the coronavirus. It is a desperate situation and critical, really, for the provision of our health service and social care. But likewise in our local authorities, again at the coalface. And I heard very little mention of the reality that we face in our local authorities with the increase in council tax. So much of it is being borne in terms of tax demand by our local residents. The withdrawal of the central government grant, there was no mention of that. Of course, local authorities are increasingly dependent on business rates. So when the government or the Chancellor announced this 12-month holiday, I'd like to know how that will be compensated for local authorities. Elsewhere with police, yes, we are seeing an increase proposed for more police, but this is just to replace where we were. But during this last 10 years, we've seen a 152% increase in violent crime. Now, on the housing crisis, the Chancellor talked about a 12 billion multi-year affordable investment in affordable housing. There was no real mention of council housing, which we're desperate for. We've lost 200,000 council homes since 2010. Just in the last few years, we've only seen 8 social rented council homes built in my constituency of Warwick and Leamington, yet rough sleeping has doubled since 2010. Elsewhere, there was brief mention of the environment and energy generation, and I would urge the government to put more investment and more support, fiscal levers, to support the development of onshore energy generation, which is the cheapest, which will help drive down energy bills. I think we lack ambition. We need to see more emphasis on that, likewise in solar. In fact, the environment got barely much mention at all, despite the considerable floods that we've had in recent weeks. And I think there is a huge opportunity to revisit the Code for Sustainable Homes and what that can do, not just for the environment, but for our house building industry. Finally, just to look at business, and I do welcome the initiatives, many of the initiatives that the Chancellor put forward, particularly for small and medium enterprises, and the business rates holiday that he is proposing. But of course, they face a huge Brexit challenge as well. And our high street shops and so on has been mentioned, has such a huge challenge because of the presence of the internet and the pressures now of the coronavirus as well as Brexit. So in closing, Mr Deputy Speaker, I believe that the last 10 years have been the lost decade. We've seen debt double from 0.95 trillion to now 2 trillion sterling. We've seen the state reduced, masquerading under austerity. But at the same time, we've seen inequality rise, 500,000 children more in poverty, whilst life expectancy has fallen for the first time. And we see in just my constituency a gap of life expectancy of 18 years between the wealthiest and the most disadvantaged. So for that reason, whilst I welcome many of the proposals from the Chancellor, there is still much to do, and I hope we will see more debate to come.